Hello and welcome to King Talks. Here we are members of the Martin Luther King Scholarship Association, and we're going to be tackling contemporary issues from the vantage point of the legacy of Martin Luther King and his plan for social justice. My name is Raul Ausa. I'm an MLK scholar and a sophomore here at Seton University.
Hello everybody, my name is Wallace Weaver. I am a senior scholar in the MLK program.
Today we're going to be talking about Black History Month. We're going to be talking about what Blackness really means today, and then we're going to go specifically into where we are now in light of really having been 50 years from the great hallmarks of the civil rights movement.
I guess we'll begin. What would you say the state of the Black Union is?
Well, I would say today the state of the Black Union is really, if not the worst it's been since the 60s, getting there. I'd say it's generally in a state of crisis. We are in a mythologically post-racial America where we don't like to talk about race. We like to think we were very eager after the civil rights movement to sort of get past our dark history in terms of our crimes against humanity through race and racism. That we really are we've downplayed it to the point where it's not even really spoken about openly in political or political circles or academia, and I think that's really destructive to the Black liberation movement, to the freedom movement, and the civil rights movement, because it takes a very serious issue and a very real issue and makes it into something covert, something secret that can't be tackled openly as it should be. And I think that's where we are now. I think that's where we've been moving for a while. But at the same time, I think we're coming to a point in crisis where it's becoming almost impossible to not look at race and to not address it openly. This past year, we've seen the Dunn case following the death of Jordan Davis. We saw the death of Trayvon Martin. And we've seen all these very openly racial topics being discussed at a time when we don't really like to address racism or racial realities. So I think those issues like these are what's going to move us forward and make it possible for us to create any sort of change around racial dialogue in the future.
I just wanted to touch on one thing I heard you say about the whole idea of a melting pot. I just think it's so interesting that the idea of a melting pot is all fine and dandy when it's other minorities assimilating to the white or popular culture, but it's totally unacceptable if it's the reverse case. Take Miley Cyrus. The whole, first of all, people need to realize Miley Cyrus was under Disney contract. The Miley that we were being exposed to was the commercialized, capitalized version of a pop star. Now that she's being who she wants to be, and she's acting in a more hood fashion or a more black manner, now everyone's up in arms. Everyone's like, oh my god, this is a good girl gone bad, or she's going down the wrong path. I'm like, no, this is Miley Cyrus acting a little bit more black, and now everyone wants to make a big deal out of it.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And it recalls the idea that came about following Reconstruction in the South. One of the major reasons that the KKK was formed and was able to be so successful was because so many white men were afraid of these new freed Negroes, these new colored men, getting hold of their women and corrupting their white women. And I think that's really what this is about. It's really about the one-drop rule, where basically, if we have someone who's tainted by blackness, who delves a little bit too much into blackness, they're corrupted. They've gone bad. They've gone sour. They're not doing what a good little white girl should be doing. But then the other side of the coin is that from the black community, there was also a lot of outrage after the Miley Cyrus incident, where they were saying that Miley Cyrus was sort of appropriating blackness, and they were denouncing that in saying that basically that was their culture, hip hop is theirs, it's their history, and therefore it's exclusively theirs. And anybody else trying to access that is sort of diluting blackness by trying to take away something that is exclusively black. And now, personally, I don't. This sort of cultural geneticism, as Professor Kwame Appiah once called it, where something created by someone of your race is therefore exclusively the property, the intellectual property of your race. Sort of really, especially among minorities, really only serves to divide us more and keeps us from having any sort of creative dialogue or progress. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and you'll see it in terms of everything, even in terms of interracial dating. I mean,
Yeah.
anytime a black person dates outside the race, they're seen as a turncoat or a traitor. They can in no way, shape, or form be in touch with Blackness or the Black movement or anything like that because they've gone outside their race.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we can't have it both ways. We can't ask to have a seat at the table and then pull another seat from somebody else.
Right.
Like if we're gonna become this idea of the beloved community,
Mm-hmm.
everyone has to have a seat on the table, and you can't denounce the one drop rule when you're the marginalized person, and then in turn start to marginalize other people.
Right. And I think all this sort of revolves around the conceptual idea of what is race. What does it mean to be black? In 2000, you had the completion of the Human Genome Project, where these European scientists, and American scientists, basically looked at everything in our DNA and mapped out our DNA throughout the world. And what they found was basically among people of different races, there isn't anything biologically that you can point out and say this person is black, this person is white, and they're fundamentally different. And that sort of challenged us because if race is a biological, as we were told it was, what is it? And looking at our DNA, it does pose a lot of problems because we have been operating on this paradigm where there is white and then there's non-whites. Originally it's just whites and blacks. Even Jews were called blacks at one point because they were non-whites. They didn't do the things that white people did. But now we're sort of starting to blur the lines a little more, and especially there has been, I think since 2009 to 2013, there's been a 32% increase in children in the United States who identify as biracial, which blurs the lines even more. So now we're getting out of this dichotomy of black and white, and we're starting to look at people who identify as biracial or multiracial, but do identify with blackness as a choice, not something that is imposed on them as it used to be. So for you, what does this mean for you that now race and this sort of racial heritage that we inherit for these biracial people and for people who aren't forced to accept a racial identity anymore, that they can sort of pick and choose what racial heritage they want to inherit, what they want to continue with, what they want to be a part of in today's melting pot?
That's a deep question. I mean, I feel like for me, blackness was never necessarily tied to race.
Mm-hmm.
But being black it's a spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a paradigm, really. It's saying, like, you're black when you realize that you are greater than your current circumstance. You're black when you realize that no set of institutionalized roadblocks can stop the power of the collective. I mean, it's an old organizing saying, there ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop. We lose our blackness when we don't realize our power.
Mm-hmm.
If we as a community continue to accept the low standards that are given to us, continue to feed into an already institutionalized cyclical poverty, if we give up and we say to ourselves that there's no more point in fighting, there's no more point in the struggle, we've gotten all we can in life, we're now a melting pot. If we accept all those things that were placed on us, then we've lost our blackness.
Right.
And like you, your skin's obviously lighter than mine, but I consider you as black as I am. I mean, so like, what does blackness mean to you?
Well, again, for me, I think it is, again, something about resistance, something about overcoming and refusing to accept the stumbling that blacks placed in front of you. And I think, as Cornel West put it in his book Race Matters, blackness really sort of becomes a metaphor for resistance and for fighting oppression, that sort of all racial minority groups, racial or not, can look at the plight and the struggle of a black man in the United States, and his resilience through that, and say that is a model for which we can go forward. In the Old Testament, we have Israel being the example for the whole world of the chosen people who were at the bottom and were able to struggle and go in faith to survive, which is what I think the black man represents for us. And again, when we come to the nature of today, once we lose that fighting spirit, once we lose that essential element of blackness, that is resistance, that is progress, that is change, that is the betterment of humankind, you do lose something essential to what was once an identity, which leads to the question of, are all black people black? There are plenty of people that we would look at racially and say, oh, that person is black, or they look black. Yet because of the paradigm shifts and economic shifts that we had for the general black community since the 1960s, you have people who are now sort of all over the spectrum. Being black doesn't being racially black or identifying as black doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be looking towards the struggle as much as people used to. You now have people like Herman Cain on the other side of the spectrum. You now have following UT Fisher. We decided that quotas aren't a good idea for picking out racial diversity anymore, because someone who's racially black isn't necessarily having the experiences that we would expect from a traditionally black person. Obama's children going to the wealthiest, to the #1 private school in the United States, isn't going to have the same perspective or culture as a black student coming from an inner city. So how do you figure out what genuine blackness is now that it's no longer just about looking at someone and saying you are black or you're not?
I feel like that's a tough question, and not to not answer a question, but to not answer it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's a more pressing concern. Just the idea of, I mean, I know you remember W.E.B. Du Bois' Talent to 10.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like our generation, in terms of our black generation, we've lost that notion. There's no more.
And just for the viewers who aren't necessarily.
Yeah, the idea of the Talent to 10th is there's a top 10th of the generation that despite all the barriers and the marginalization and alienization that a black person faces, they make it. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that being a part of the Talent to 10th is you're going to then make it a point to better the community in which you came from. It's an obligation to do better, to help pull up people like you were pulled up. Mm-hmm. And I feel like now our generation is so wrapped up in this rugged individualism that there is no longer an obligation to really build the failed communities that we managed to make it out of. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but it's the exact reason why Harry Belafonte calls out Jay-Z, because like it's not enough to just make it, but it's about how are you helping other people to make it. And I feel like, again, when we lose that spirit, that is how we lose our blackness.
So Wallace, you're a political organizer, you're an MLK scholar. In light of what's happened, everything that's happened in the past year, we've had so many hot button racial issues, especially surrounding young black males and the violence that they're facing. How do you, as a young black male in college, following these issues adamantly, as educated as you are, what is your response to this? What does it mean for where we are now, and how do we move forward?
I think the troubling thing about it is to look at it like we as a community we're set up to fail. If you look at the way our education system is designed, the way wealth inequality is set up as it is in the country right now, just like black people, black males in particular, are just not in a position to achieve. Particularly within the schools, the bar is just always set low. Like, I remember applying to college. I was applying to IUP, a small state school in PA. And I remember the admissions counselor, he said, he looked at my grades, he was like, wow, that's really, really great scores for a black guy. And I'm like, oh, well, that's awesome, but how are my scores in comparison to just in general? And just like, we purposely set the bar low for black students, for young black individuals. And like, when we set low expectations, what incentive does that give a child to excel or to do well in life, or to advance himself or his family out of the current state in which they find themselves in? I feel like we're just constantly in a situation where we're letting the outside forces tell us where we are in life, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. And then I'd say a big piece of that too is the fact that not just that society has such low expectations, but like you said, we really are set up to fail in the sense that, for example, right now there are more black men in prison, and we're going through our prison system than were enslaved in 1863. So we have really these undeniable figures. We have a huge section of our population growing up in poverty, almost specifically based on their race, and we have these huge numbers in terms of income gap among different races. And so, these are the realities of race. But what does race mean today? Since it's something that we don't want to talk about anymore, it's something that we've seemed to move by. What does it mean to be black in America today?
I think that's a really interesting question. I feel like it's something that we've stopped asking ourselves. Because for me, when I think of what does it mean to be black, it's something that, honestly, it transcends race, and you don't have to be of African descent, or a Latino brother they can too be considered black. It's about a shared history of struggle, and not only struggle, but resiliency and perseverance. Like, we have gotten to where we are as a people from our grandfathers and our grandmothers who marched in the streets, who were in sit-ins, and I feel like where we are now is we've lost that spirit of perseverance. I mean, look at any of the program we have on our own campus of Seton Hall. We'll have endless programs on relationships, on love, on media, but we won't have anything on really what it means to demonstrate, to take a stand, to protest, to really challenge your own local communities and state and even federal communities to really push for progressive movements. And I feel like we're gonna lose that when we lose our grandparents.
Yeah, I can agree with that, because I think there was definitely a time in our social and political history where identifying as being a black man or a black woman automatically meant that politically and socially you were progressive. Your race and the culture that brought with you, being a history of oppression, a history of struggle, meant that you would continue that struggle in your context, in your day, as America evolved. But we have sort of seen a divorce in that blackness isn't so much linked to fighting anymore. And I think the sad part is that there's sort of less of an expectation on the part of the black community for it to be a catalyst of progress as it used to be. In the 1880s and the 70s, you had the Black Panther Party and the new Black Panther Party being at the forefront of the peace movement in response to Vietnam. They were helping the Catholic workers. After the 80s, after our recessions in terms of helping the poor community, there was always the black element when it came to the civil rights struggles that followed the 60s. We're not really seeing that as much, and black culture is sort of becoming more tied up around really what I think most of us who want to continue to see progress would call superfluous. It's all about hip hop. It's all about glamour, music, and sort of material possessions, where our role models aren't aren't the caliber that we used to have. They aren't the Malcolm X's. They aren't the Martin Luther Kings that we used to look up to and idolize the way we used to.
Alright, so how do we get ourselves back to that militant and alright, so how do we get ourselves
How do we regain that militancy? Yeah.
okay, how do we get ourselves back to that militancy? How do we get ourselves back to that really forthright and sustainable movement towards justice?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think it would start on a very basic level with being honest with ourselves about racial realities in America today. We can't expect progress if we can't be honest about, in our conversations about politics and sociology, about whether or not race is a factor. It obviously is. It doesn't always need to be, but until we address it as such, it's going to continue to be. Once we address the fact that we have historically been unjust to our black brothers and sisters, once we address the fact that they are still suffering because of 400 years of slavery and then another 100 years of segregation and white oppression and domination, then we can begin to move forward. Very recently in 2013 we had the UT Austin case, where basically affirmative action was done away with, in practice if not in word. And you know, there are various ways to interpret that, but I think the very superficial, surface way that most Americans will look at it is just another way of saying racism is over, and that this is a piece of that Berlin Wall coming down, almost as if it's something to be celebrated. Where I think that really we need to be looking at race in a way that we haven't really since the 80s, where it doesn't necessarily mean anymore that you are of a particular economic background or that you are of a particular mindset, but that it is something to be carried because there are an overwhelming number of blacks who are for all intents and purposes at the bottom of society and aren't finding a way out.
I agree, and to that point, I think it's foolish to say that we could have gone through 400 plus years of slavery, 100 plus years of segregation, and to think that we can make it to a post-racial society in a mere 50 years or so since the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we need to be upfront with each other, with ourselves, and say like, great, we're not past racism, and racism is still something that we need to deal with. Take example the Super Bowl with that cornerback, I believe the last name was Sherman, being labeled a thug because he was jawing off, doing what any good football player would do on a football field when they're making a nice play. But the media, in whatever rationale they wanted to use, instead of flat out calling him a nigger, they decided to call him a thug. And I feel like we shouldn't be in a place where we can just say, oh well, it's not a race issue because we weren't using actual race, or we were using this new age word,
Right.
Racism 2.0, if you will. And I feel like we need to be honest with ourselves, and I feel like we need to take a step back. 'Cause I feel like a lot of people want to say, all right, well, not everything's a race issue, and granted, not everything is a race issue, but I think we need to be honest in like calling things for what they are.
Right. Yeah, and I agree, because I think too often the ones who are saying this isn't a race issue are the ones who would suffer most if it were a race issue, or who would be looked at negatively if it were to be a race issue. And it often is. During the Trayvon Martin case, you had a litany of voices who were shouting down those of us who were pointing out the racial aspects of the case, saying, oh, you're just hate mongers, you're just race baiters, trying to stir up problems. But people forget how 50 years is nothing. There hasn't been a huge generational shift. The only thing that's really changed is our marketing. We're not openly talking about Negroes or coloreds or even blacks anymore. We sort of dulled everything down. Everything's sort of become about ethnicity as opposed to race. Everybody is either African American or Caucasian or Irish. Everybody's sort of divided and quiet, and we all sort of like to pretend that we're as much a melting pot as we are sort of this sort of bland, colorless mixture. And diversity has really not become about our celebrating differences so much, but it's sort of pretending that they don't exist at all, which is where I think problems start to come in.
Sorry, could you?
So as we're starting to conclude, just doing a review of the recent events. The Jordan Davis trial just ended, and his killer, Mr. Dunn, was found guilty of attempted murder, but not murder. A very short period of time after the Zimmerman case, where again a lot of people felt that justice wasn't done, and it's really following a wave of violence against black children in the United States. These children again were just 16 and 17, very young, had their lives taken away from them, really for no other reason than you had white individuals who were threatened or felt threatened by young black males. And we can speculate to the fact that it was primarily because they were young black males, and for that they lost their lives. With the Trayvon Martin case, you had some assumption of violence, but here you don't even have that. So really, again, I do believe we are in a state of crisis that we haven't really seen for a while, because we've been trying to sweep all of it under the rug. But you have children and human beings dying at an accelerated rate because we are living in a broken system that we can't fix until we accept that it is broken. So I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think we need to, first we need to stop. We need to stop this idea that in using people like Trayvon Martin or Davis, who was just killed, like, we can't allow ourselves to say, all right, we'll stop politicizing the issue, or stop politicizing the death. When Bloody Sunday happened, Martin King made it a point to say that we will not only dramatize but politicize this event until it is a household common like name recognized thing in every family. Like, the civil rights movement wasn't successful until you had the face of Emmett Till staring every American family in the face on their TV screens. That was the first thing they heard on the radio. If we are to sustain any types of real civil rights movement in our own generation, we need to make sure that Trayvon Martin's name is forever on our lips. We need to make sure that Davis and every other, even minor injustice that we face as a people, we need to dramatize and politicize those things and bring those to the front of the Beltway. Like, we need to stop talking about all these like grandiose and very like general topics, and like really start getting down to like names and circumstances, and really putting a face to this like faceless issue, and really demanding that it's addressed.
Yeah, I mean, it was once said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and I do think that applies here, in that we can't continue to be silent. We can't let these children's death not affect us, in the sense that it should be a catalyst for us to say that this is enough. This should be the last child who dies because of this broken system. This should be the last injustice that we allow ourselves to see. And that's where I think Black History Month comes into play. That's what I think the importance of Black History Month is that it puts all these things into context. This isn't just one child whose life was taken. This is one in a long lineage of unwilling martyrs, unknowing victims of racial violence, who we need to recognize as such in order for us to move forward.
Yeah, like we don't recognize Emmett Till because he was a black man who was beat up and thrown in a creek somewhere and forgotten. We remember him because he was the straw that broke the camel's back. We don't remember the 6 gentlemen that did the first sit-in at the Greensboro counter because they were just 6 guys who wanted to sit in. We remember them because they were the catalyst that started the sit-in movement. That is why Black History Month is so important. It's not just to remember them for remembrance sake, but to take the lesson from it, and I have to agree with you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that being said, looking at everything that's happened today, that's sort of, we need to wake up from the slumber that we've been in, and sort of get out of the hiatus that the liberation movement and the civil rights movement has been on for so long, because once again, we are coming to the breaking point. We're seeing more Emmett Tills. We're seeing injustices blatantly that we haven't seen in such force since the 60s. And I think it's time for us to really pick up the movement and carry on. And I think that should be the main message of this year's Black History Month, the official theme for which is civil rights. So I think that's where we are today.
Yeah, maybe it's not even celebrate Black history. Maybe it's go out and make Black history.
I think that's a great point. I think that's where we're on today. My name is Raul Lausa, and this is Wallace Weaver from MLKSA, and this has been King Talks. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.